Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Exit Wound. I'm your host, Melanie Thompson. So during this podcast, we focused a lot on the exiting process, the exit when you're trying to get out of the life. We focused on the complex traumas, the fears, the loneliness. We've talked about navigating, rebuilding your life. We've talked about the 9-to-5 life, money insecurity. But today I want to talk about the different services and organizations in New York City that will help survivors go through that entire rebuilding process. And today, helping me have this conversation, we have Nicole, a sex trafficking survivor, and we have Jayne Bigelsen, who is an ally and advocate that works with sex trafficking survivors. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
How are you guys today?
Great. Thank you so much for having us and doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me in conversation. So, as you know, we are all residents of New York City, and we live in this 8 million. How many people are in New York City?
I just know it's a lot.
It's a lot of people. I think it's 8 million, a population of 8 million people. So on the one hand, we know that we have plenty of organizations that are doing great work, that are serving survivors of trafficking and prostitution. We know that there are a lot of direct service organizations. We also know that we need more services, and we know that there is gaps in many ways. We have a lack of beds. We can talk about all of that in a little while. We also know that there are a lot of women-centered organizations that service individuals who, specifically women, who are going through, intimate partner violence or anything like that. Nicole, I want to start with you as a fellow survivor. Although we have these women-centered services, we also know that there are a lot of women-centered services that don't necessarily cater to sex trafficking survivors the way that we need to. So can you walk me through the first steps after you exited the life? Were you connected to any specific services that helped you? And if not, what were some of the services that you needed that you think would have been beneficial for you when you exited?
Yes, of course. So as soon as I exited the life, the first thing that was in my heart is that I needed a safe space to be. I needed the comfort of a warm bed, a warm meal, to make sure that I was going to be in a place where I wasn't going to need to go back just to get a bed, just to get a meal, and just to get a place to wash myself and be myself on. So when I got to the shelter, the first thing that they did for me was getting me in contact with a social worker. I really appreciate it because I was able to, express myself and tell her, hey, this is my situation. This is what I went through. She told me, well, this is the services that we got, but I feel that we can offer you this. She did a planned situation for me. Mm-hmm. The very first services that I got was the medical health, because I haven't seen a doctor in 8 years. As soon as I got to the shelter, the first thing that I did was see a doctor. And there were a couple of things that I got diagnosed. I found out I had asthma. Didn't even know I had asthma for a whole 8 years. I got diagnosed before with PCOS, but I didn't really got the chance to get treatment or anything, but I was able to get that treatment at the shelter that I was staying in. So definitely medical health. I wasn't expecting to get any kind of therapy. I wasn't even open to therapy at the beginning. I just wanted to have a place to live, have a place to escape from that reality that was for me at the time, and just then move on and find out something else to do, maybe work I don't know, as a cleaning lady or something. That was the expectation, because I was, daughter of an immigrant that was doing the same thing. And my whole family set up that expectation on me. So that was my expectation of myself. Sometimes we don't have that privilege of going to school or having even the financial, stability and support from our parents or from our family to educate ourselves beyond high school or middle school. Many of us have dreams that we just have to forget about because we don't have that support.
Nicole, you said a couple of very interesting things that I think are super, super important to re-emphasize. First, do you mind if I ask you how old you were when you were trafficked?
Well, I think I don't really remember. It was a really tumultuous time in my life. I think it was around 10 to 11, and it was when, unfortunately, my caretaker passed away, and it was just me in the world.
So you were a very young child at this time. So I can only imagine, before anything else, that upon your exit, you were probably confused, not sure if you had any familial support. We don't have to get into those things, but it's very difficult as an adult who is engaged in prostitution to find services, let alone somebody at that age. What I heard you mention was that housing and medical were really, really important for you to help you along in your exiting journey. I know for many survivors that I know personally and that have been on the show, we all have talked about the importance of not having access to medical services while we were in the life, which is something that you just mentioned. And then upon coming out, having all of these illnesses and diagnoses, and we didn't know how to navigate those services afterwards. We didn't know what those things were. Oftentimes we know that traffickers tend to neglect allowing us to get access to medical care and things like that. And then, of course, housing. And you said for you, it was a housing shelter that helped you get connected to some of these services. And, as we are currently experiencing what is being referred to as the migrant crisis here in New York City, we know that is something that is super, super imperative to have. Just the shelters in place and then having access to these housing services and connections. Jayne, I want to jump to you. So before anything else, you are somebody who's worked in direct services here in New York City, specifically with survivors of trafficking, runaway and homeless youth, individuals that are all susceptible to this issue at large. Can you first talk about the work that you've done and what you're doing currently?
Absolutely. First, though, can I just say, I don't want to embarrass you, just how proud I am of Nicole, because she mentioned, what her beginning goals were, and now she works full-time in a city council member's office.
Yes,
and she's helping other people, and I knew her kind of at the not quite the beginning of the healing journey, and just to watch that was absolutely incredible. So I had to say that.
Well, let's take a moment for that. Congratulations, Nicole, on all of your success in your journey.
Thank you so much.
I think that we don't take the time to recognize survivors enough in that. And it's a long journey, and I always say that it's a lifelong journey. Oftentimes people will come up to survivors. I'm sure you may have gotten this question as well. Like, how did you heal? You're so strong. How do you do it every day? And we have to keep telling folks, this is not a overnight, we wake up and we just figure it out. We still deal with it every day, but you still manage to push through. You're here on this episode talking with us, so we're super proud of you. I wish I can do the button that plays applause for everybody. So congrats to you. Yes, Jayne, tell us about, the work that you've done and what you're doing now.
So these days I'm doing more advocacy-centered work on human trafficking, and that's really important because the laws of New York State are going to affect the experiences of people in the life of prostitution and survivors of trafficking. So these days I'm trying to get laws changed. I don't know if you want to go into details on what those laws are, but before that, for the past 12 years, I was working also in policy and advocacy, but in direct services as well, direct legal services, program running to make sure that survivors had everything that they need, right? Whether it's mental health or medical care. There's a whole gamut of things that Nicole just mentioned that you need when you're exiting the life.
Absolutely. And can you talk about some of the organizations that you know in New York City that offer some of these resources Nicole and I were mentioning?
Yeah, we are lucky to live in New York City in that there are services, not enough.
Never enough.
There's never enough. But particularly if you're under the age of 24, there are more services. An organization called GEMS. I think they're known worldwide for working with survivors of trafficking. And then the homeless youth system. It's like a big, shelter system that also has wraparound services for young people experiencing homelessness. And that's run by the Department of Youth and Community Development, DYCD. So they would know where there are beds in that system. But there's organizations like The Door, Covenant House, Streetwork, Safe Horizons. There's a decent amount of services if you're under the age of 24. It gets harder if you're over the age of 24, but there's still organizations like Restore, Mentari, and Sanctuary for Families, who I just, really are rock stars when it comes to helping survivors of gender-based violence in New York City.
Absolutely. like we said at the beginning of this episode, we're going to be real transparent. There are gaps, right? Nationwide, but specifically in New York City, because we have a population of 8 million, right?
Yeah.
We are never going to have enough services to be able to fulfill the increased amount of folks who are impacted by trafficking and the system of prostitution, which we know to be very, very insidious, but also which we know to target individuals who usually have a lack of resources and services, right? So it's kind of this catch-22. We know that the system of prostitution and sex trafficking targets individuals for not having a bed, for not having money, for not having enough food, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And then we're trying to, accommodate, figure out direct services. We're trying to find beds for folks, knowing we don't have enough beds. So it's a lot. And we know that there's a lot more to be done. But I do think that it's important to highlight these things. We do know, like you said, Jayne, for children under 24, and even in some programs for children under 26, we have all of these organizations that you mentioned. We have Sanctuary for Families for Adults. We have the Empower Center, which I don't think you mentioned, which is super important when we talk about housing and medical, like Nicole was mentioning, right? These are services that we know that are New York City based and specific, but that cater to all ages of folks who have been impacted, regardless of how you identify. So I think it's really important to give them a shout as well. You said Restore. We have Restore NYC, who does direct services as well. And then, of course, you have your family justice centers in every borough, which are places that if you are a survivor who is listening and you may not know where to turn, that could be one place to start. And usually what I like about family justice centers in particular is that even though they may not have all the direct services on hand, they usually have the entire list of resources on where to go in New York City. So you could start with a Google search, but we do have a couple of places that we work alongside that are doing this work. So thank you for highlighting those. And for any additional organizations that are not mentioned here today, we will put that in the show notes. So for folks, if you are listening or if you are watching this and you don't know where to start, we will have that list listed out for you. Thanks for that. So Jayne, continuing with you, you've done a lot of past work and current work with young people. What would you say are some of the services that you think benefited young people the most? Young people specifically either at risk for trafficking or that have been exploited already.
It's hard to pick one, right? It's everything. If you don't have a bed, I mean, there's research showing that if you don't have a bed within like 3 days, a trafficker is ready to pounce. So we need more beds, particularly for that older age group, right? Over the age of 21. But now with the migrant crisis in the city, like I think we need beds for everybody, right? And that's, you have to meet the immediate needs. I mean, Nicole spoke to this a little bit. Mental health care is so key, but if someone doesn't have a safe place to sleep and food to eat and clothes to wear, then all that like mental health care, legal help, like that comes next, right?
It's interesting. Sorry to cut you off, because you already like jumped into my head of what I was going to ask you next, right? And you mentioned that for young people, the services that you see most impactful are all of them and the immediate needs, right? And addressing those. But then thinking about what are some other vulnerable populations that you've seen and what services maybe need to be specific to them, you've kind of already mentioned, right? We have the migrant crisis in New York City. We have the older population, which a lot of people don't talk about the trafficking that affects senior folks, right? Or folks over the age of 65 or, and them needing beds. So would you say that the services that are needed for these other marginalized and vulnerable groups kind of parallel the same services that you think were important for young people?
I think if you're younger, there's an added vulnerability because let's talk, sex buyers want people young. It's, disgusting and gross, but that's what they want, right? So children are at risk. I think 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are often at the largest risk because, I mean, it's sick to think about it, but the law cares less, right, about sex with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So traffickers like to seek that age group and pass them off for children. So they're at such a heightened risk. But, I talked about the short-term needs, but you need those long-term needs too, right? Once you've got the bed, once you've got food, then you need the mental health care and you need the job training and education, right? Because that's your protection against re-trafficking. But I did not answer your question, sorry, Melanie, about specific groups. You know me, I frequently,
No, this
I'm
is
all over the
great.
place.
Listen.
So, specific groups, I mean, these days, I mean, my heart is breaking for the young migrants, right? I mean, they have endured hell to get here. The traffickers are looking for vulnerabilities. Who is more vulnerable than someone who's new to this country, right?
Doesn't speak the language.
Doesn't have work authorization, right? These young people,
really
all they want to do is work, right?
Yeah.
All they want to do is work. And when they can't legally work, I assure you that pimp and that trafficker is trying to recruit them.
Nicole, would you say that in your experience, I know earlier, and I'm going off script here, but you mentioned that you being an immigrant as well, like dealing with the immigration in your family and in your backstory, would you say that you can agree with some of the things Jayne is mentioning on how those vulnerabilities are specific to you?
I definitely can. Sorry about that.
No, you're
I
good.
definitely can. I'm always hearing this, especially from the older generation, saying that with migrants coming here, all they do is take their jobs, take public benefits, take the food stamps, take free housing or affordable housing that's meant for them. And I think this is a big misconception, because me as an immigrant, when I was going through the situation where I didn't have a social security, I didn't have a work authorization, I didn't even have a stable job or a stable source of income just to sustain myself or my family. Right. Nobody ever came to me and told me, hey, you can get food stamps. Even if I tried to apply, the answer will be, oops, sorry, you don't have a social security. Or if I try to apply for an apartment, it will come down to, oh, you don't have a credit, you don't have a working history build up. How can I if I don't have the chance to do that?
Right.
So so most of the migrant people that comes into this country, usually what they do is come for their families or with friends, so they can live together and support together. Because even citizens right now, if you look at a citizen person that's living from minimum income, you can't afford nothing with minimum income
at all.
Nonetheless, a migrant person that gets paid less than the minimum income. When I was working as a migrant, I used to get paid $7 an hour, and this was in 2000 I think 2018 or 19. I used to get paid $7 an hour, and then the rest of the money, my contractor or my boss will keep that money. So it will be revenue for them, because they are paying me less and they're keeping the rest of the money. So this is what people that are migrants that come here face.
Right.
This is what we face. We don't get paid fairly. We don't get free housing. We don't get food stamps. We don't get none of these things that everybody's claiming that we get. Or at least I didn't.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo everything that Nicole said. It is such a myth, right, that people are coming over here and taking our services. Because if you're not documented, you are not eligible for those services.
Exactly.
And all they want to do is work. And how many restaurants in New York City can't find staff, right? So that they're taking jobs that no one else wants.
No one else wants.
Right?
Yeah.
So that is the biggest myth, and it's that type of like fear-mongering that put people even at higher risk for trafficking.
You just said something that just made a light bulb go off in my head, but I'm going to get to that in a second. So Nicole, would you say, what would you say were some of the services that helped you the most? I mean, I know you touched on like housing and medical a little bit. In this particular arena, and it could be related to your immigration or not, what services in New York City did you find were most helpful for you?
Well, first of all, shout out to The Door, because it was through The Door that I found the shelter. It was through The Door that I was getting the legal assistance to get my work authorization, put in my case for CJs, and just pretty much it's through them that I got everything, I used to go through I found out through college I was going to BMCC when I was doing a little bit more better. And I tried to put myself through college, fail at that.
Yeah, we all tried
so
to.
I went to The Door because my advisor told me, and I was like, hey, I'm here, this is my situation, what I can do. They were very kind. They offered me legal assistance. I'm still working with them. I have an open case with them. Then I open up and I started telling them this is what's going on to me. I don't know what to do. They connect me with a social worker, and in the social worker was helping me out find a shelter that was suitable for me. I think I lasted like a year year trying to find a shelter, because also there was a lot of things setting me back, and it's very hard to take the decision into the next step. That is leaving the life. It's because it's such a while, and you're so used to it already, you're so desensitized, and you feel like you don't have anything better going on. It's such a hard step to take. So when I did that, I was extremely scared.
Yeah.
And what was the question again?
I love that. Just asking, like, what services were the most helpful for you that you found in New York City?
Definitely the door. And as a young person, having a place where you can go and you know, just go and be like, hey, I'm hungry, can I have a meal? Because they do that at the door. You can just go up to them and tell them I'm hungry, and they will give you a hot plate of food. I used to go there all the time after college. I didn't want to be home, so right there. They have workshops. They help young people building up their resumes. They have social workers. They have programs. They also have like a little medical space down there where you can get access to a doctor, which I used to use a lot before going to the shelter. So yeah, it definitely places like the door, like youth centers that offer all these services at their hands. It's the best thing ever. Like I feel centers like the door should be in every borough, in every neighborhood for young people.
And I think what you're highlighting speaks to what Jayne was talking about the need for addressing the immediate needs, right? Before you can even talk about the long-term needs that will sustain us and prevent us from relapsing into the system of prostitution and trafficking, right? We need to eat. We need a hot meal. We need a shower. Before we can even go to a doctor's office or something like that.
Absolutely. And I think if I look back at some of the mistakes I might have made in my career, there were people wanting to offer legal services and mental health care.
Right.
And just trying to talk to young people about those things when they're like, miss, I'm hungry. Or, I mean, I vividly remember trying to talk to a young person and get them to see a lawyer. And she was like, all my belongings are in like a storage closet somewhere, and if I don't like pay that rent, it's gonna be, it's gonna be all lost. I don't want to talk to a lawyer about like, an arrest on my records. I want my stuff.
Right.
So I mean, I kind of learned early on that if you don't meet those immediate needs, forget talking about
anything else.
Anything else.
And we talk in another episode about trust and the relationships between folks who are survivors or folks who just recently exited, and social workers and direct service providers and advocacy organizations. We have another episode on that, but just going back to that and relating it, and especially coming from somebody who's been through the foster care system and has gone through these institutions, right? Like, you could not get me to say anything if my stomach is growling, if I was given an emergency evacuation order and had 10 minutes to throw all my stuff in a bag. The first time that and I think ACS is something that we have not mentioned. We have the Children's Center here in New York City as a resource, and we didn't mention that. But when I was going through the Children's Center at that time, they gave me a hairbrush and like a sweatsuit, pajamas or something like that, right? And the only thing I'm thinking about is like, I miss my own clothes. So like, no social worker could come up to me at that time and try to tell me, hey, let's talk about like your trafficking case. Like, I wasn't thinking about that. So I think two things that I'm hearing highlighted here is the importance of focusing on immediate services and the immediate needs of the person. And then once we get that out of the way, focusing on the wraparound services that can serve with its longevity, and helping us not to relapse and to live sustainable lives. Jayne, something that the light bulb that went off on my head earlier, you were talking a bit about how we have the migrants coming to New York City and how much, all they want to do is work, yet because of their lack of work authorization and their papers and this, that, and the third, they're not getting these jobs despite popular belief or gossip or whatever. But at the same time, right, and on the flip side, we have so many restaurants and other organizations and other jobs here in New York City that are looking for staff.
Exactly.
Right? So what came to my head with that is that work authorization, that lack of work authorization rather, is a barrier. Right? Can you talk about some of the barriers and other gaps in services in New York City as it pertains to trafficking survivors or folks who are at risk for this?
Absolutely. So lack of work authorization is a huge one. But as I said before, the pimps and the traffickers are looking for any vulnerability, right? So any service need that you are lacking, they are going to pounce on. A colleague once told me that traffickers and pimps have the same skills that we advocacy, people do, but that they use it for bad. And I was like, what are you talking about? A pimp does not have the same skills I have. And they're like, yes, they work with a young person and they see what their weaknesses are, right? And what their strengths are, just like we do, but they do the opposite, right? They go for the vulnerabilities and they decrease the strengths where
they use those vulnerabilities to control you,
exactly,
use it against you, blackmail you.
Exactly.
A lot of immigrant people that's under the sex trade, I think the most hurt threat that I heard was, I'm gonna get someone to deport you, I'm gonna get someone to send you back.
Yeah.
And people that come here, just like Jayne said, they come to work to help themselves, to get a better education, to help a sick family member or their children back home. So going back to that point, and going back to their countries, and again starving to death and starving their children to death, nobody will want that.
Of course
not even. I don't think anybody in America or the USA will want that for their own children. So why should we?
Exactly. I didn't answer the whole question though about what services are missing, right? Mental health care. There's a lot, but it's not enough. And particular mental health care for trauma, right? I've heard talk therapy is great, but there are special modalities for people who've experienced complex trauma. And that takes practitioners who are very skilled and trained, and there's not enough of them. So that's one. Job training and education, there's a lot of, but there needs more, because again, we talked about that being an armor for re-exploitation. One of the things I really think is missing, though, is most programs only have 6 months of aftercare services.
I love that.
And a survivor is at risk for re-exploitation for much longer than 6 months, right? I mean, I remember when COVID first hit and people lost jobs, I heard from survivors who've been out of the life for years saying, I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent, right? And for the first time in years, I'm thinking of taking a date, which is, going back into the life of prostitution. So there's always, there's always vulnerabilities and risks can happen years later. So I think every program should be there for a survivor for the rest of their lives, right? If there were you and I have discussed this, there's emergency grants, right? Because anybody can fall on hard times. And like I said, the traffickers have a sixth sense for when someone's at a hard time. So we need, hopefully you and I can create a program where survivors can be served any point after their trafficking at any age.
That would be my dream.
Yes,
if there
we
was
have to do that together.
Any kind of programming, funding for survivors. And anybody that knows me knows that aftercare is one of my favorite things to talk about, right? Because I think, as you highlighted before, one of the more important things to address immediately are the immediate needs, right? The food, like the minute you exit, the minute that you're connected to a shelter or another service, right? I need to eat something. And you can't think straight if you don't have a meal. We all know how that goes. Exactly. But I feel like there are more organizations and services and resources here in New York City that are willing to provide hot meals. Even if you go to a soup kitchen or something like that, right? There are places you can go to get petty cash to eat. You can get a voucher from McDonald's. Like, there are places that you can go to get something. But then after we've filled your bellies, right? After we've given you a place to shower, after the Children's Center gives me a set of pajamas, right? Where do you go from there? When I was in foster care, my child discharge was only a couple months. After that, it was like, good luck, And
it's insane,
what happens to that 22-year-old, 23-year-old, right? In the eyes of the law, they're an adult. But they're back now trying to learn life skills, one, find life funding, live, like, as I like to say, like, we're adulting, right? We're trying to transition into this adulting phase, but we're not equipped with all the things we need. And as you mentioned, both traffickers and sex buyers notice those vulnerabilities and target you because of that. So it would be, in my Barbie world, in my head, we have a program that stays with you at least if we can't do till death, then at least do till like 50, you know, like I don't think we're ready. I don't think we're ready at 27, 28, 23, 22 to be able to go into the life and kind of get rid of all of that. Nicole, do you agree with Jayne? Have you seen any other gaps or things in New York City when it comes to services and how they address trafficking survivors?
Yeah, I was about to interrupt you to say that.
So.
Yeah. So I feel, and I don't mean to offend anybody in the council, but I feel that the state fails us as sex trafficking survivors and human trafficking survivors, because I don't see any kind of program. You know how there is senior citizen programs for like help to paying rent, to freeze your rent. There's many different programs for many different communities, but I don't see a lot of programs for human trafficking survivors. I don't see the state being like, hey, here's a paycheck to help pay your rent for this amount of time until you get settled, until you learn how to adult, just like you said. When we exited the life, this is all we knew. Some of us, like me, this is all we knew for years and years, and maybe all our lives, all our conscious life. So when we go outside and we find out there is so many things that we can do and there is so many things that we can experience, it can be pretty overwhelming, and it can be pretty saddening, because you feel disappointed in yourself that you didn't get to experience all of that like any other normal being. Unfortunately, we are not, like, we didn't develop normally because of this, because of all this trauma. Right. So us getting thrown into the world like that, it leaves us completely vulnerable. Exactly. So I feel that the state, that the city should be offering more services for like rental assistance, for food stamps. You should give food stamps for domestic violence and for human trafficking survivors.
You know what I love? I love that you started your answer by calling out the state. And I won't say calling out, because that sounds combative. I'm not being mean, guys. But I love that you highlighted that, because, you know, in listening to everything that we've been talking about, in hearing, you know, that there are all these gaps in services and that there's a lack of resources, even though I want to highlight that New York City has been doing better than we were 10 years ago at recognizing human trafficking as a problem. And I think, more to your point, the reason that we have not had in New York City, you know, these specific services for sex trafficking survivors is because we only just recently had the conversation to recognize it as an issue in our penal system, right? So to that point, I'm going to big up New York, but I'm also going to say, like, do better, New York, right? So Jayne, with that in mind, this entire podcast, as we're talking about the exit, when survivors first exit, all the way and following their trajectory all the way until they become survivor leaders, our targeted audience in mind for this are three main groups of people. We're talking to other survivors, or survivors who are newly exiting, or fellow survivors that have been out a long time. We're talking to direct service providers, the owners, the people who work there, the founders, etc. And we're also talking to people in positions of power and authority, like legislators and folks who can actually make tangible change when it comes to this issue, right? So Jayne, for you, to donors, to legislators, two very popular, powerful groups that can actually make change, what is something that you want to say to those two groups specifically?
Legislators and donors. First, like donors, what we talked about, unmet needs, that lifelong or at least decade or years long aftercare, right? And Nicole mentioned emergency help. There are programs where you can get beds and shelters, but if you're living in an apartment on your own and you lose your job, right, like there should be some sort of assistance that's going to help prevent you get back to being exploited again, right? So that's really important. I also think there needs to be some scholarships out there, right? Whether it's...
Forgot to mention that. I was going right there. Scholarships. There's scholarships for immigrants. There's scholarships for students that comes from all the places. There should be scholarships for human trafficking survivors, for labor trafficking survivors, for even domestic violence survivors that wants to go back to college and rebuild their lives.
Yep.
It should be there
already. Mel and I have talked about our dream, right? We have many dreams, but one of them, this is part of a joint dream, is that, emergency assistance, but scholarships, whether it's college or vocational or small business loans, we talked about it before, that is the best armor against trafficking, is having skills and a career. So I'd love to see a scholarship program. To legislators, though, there's also some advocacy issues to talk about. The first thing is, please do not buy into this movement that says sex work is work and that fully decriminalizing the sex trade is progressive. I don't know who decided that, but it's not, because what happens when you decriminalize the sex trade, and that is something that's being considered in legislatures across the country. What happens when you do that is you create a sex trade market, right? Yes, there are some people, we can debate how many who are consensually in the sex trade. I understand why they want full decriminalization, but you can't do that without crossing out in the law the act of sex buying and promoting being a crime. And when you cross those things out in the law, sex buyers from all over the world will descend on New York City, right? And there would be some people willing to sell sex, but not enough. And the traffickers are not going to leave that money on the table. So they are going to pull new people into the sex trade, right? And who are they going to pull? The most vulnerable among us, right? Young adults experiencing homelessness, vulnerable, marginalized population. And I do not know what's progressive. And frankly, let's be honest, it's primarily white men buying poor women of color. So I don't know what's progressive about that at all. So legislators, do not fall for that. Full decriminalization is not a good idea. Instead, we've all worked on something called the equality model, which is the partial decriminalization of prostitution. There is absolutely no reason to ever arrest someone for selling sex, right? They are not hurting anyone. Often they're victims. But we need to keep arresting the sex buyers and the promoters and the traffickers. Otherwise, human trafficking is going to explode. And I'll just one more point. I could go, I could go on all day for that. I won't, I promise. Just one last point though. I've worked with so many survivors in my career, and they've all said how awful not only the pimps and traffickers were, but the sex buyers. We do not want to do anything that's going to increase the number of sex buyers, right? So if you decriminalize sex buying, you make more sex buyers, right? No sex buying, no trafficking. More sex buying, more trafficking. It's pretty basic. So we do not want to decriminalize the sex buyers. So legislators, I hope you're listening to this. It is not progressive at all.
This was really interesting because what I love about this podcast is that we can always start one place and end up in another place. Yes. And from what I'm hearing, right, what we need to do in general, as I mentioned earlier, this is all about seeing survivors turn into survivor leaders, right? And then following that timeline. Nicole, what I've heard you mention, both of you mentioning really, is the need for scholarships, the need for focusing on finding ways to fill those gaps in services for the immediate needs of a survivor, both when they exit, but also to sustain themselves throughout. I've heard the importance of aftercare services, and making sure that those aftercare services are not just 3 months or less, but at the very least, a good chunk of years after, to be able to really walk alongside survivors and not just throw them and say, here's a goodie bag and hopefully it helps. On the flip side, Jayne, what I'm also hearing, which I think is a point that's very interesting to bring up, is the fact that if we want to truly support a survivor in becoming survivor leaders, we have to also somehow tackle trying to eradicate trafficking as a whole, trying to eradicate the system of prostitution. And to our legislators, in order to tackle this issue, in order to shrink sex trafficking as a whole, in order to ensure that more survivors, our next generation, does not end up in the same places Nicole and I both were engaged in, right? Or that Nicole and I both were, I think that was more proper. Legislators need to really analyze the way that they approach and legislate on this issue. So what I'm hearing you say is that to our legislators, support the equality model, recognize that we need to not fully decriminalize this as this issue is only going to increase under full decriminalization. More to your point, Jayne, what we're trying to focus on is not expanding the sex trade and focusing on the actions and behaviors and harms of those who perpetuate that system. So to our legislators, we want to support the equality model. What about to donors? Do you have anything to say to them on how to support, a survivor becoming a survivor leader, or what more can they do in New York City?
Absolutely. Do just want to mention, though, with the partial full debate, it's about whether we want to fully decriminalize the sex trade. And I think all three of us are like, absolutely not. But the question was donors. And I think it's everything we said, right? The continuing to fund the basic needs, but then also the long-term needs. Scholarships, please. I want to start a scholarship program. I want to start an emergency fund, but also support our advocacy work, right? Funders often don't like to support advocacy, but if we allow the full decriminalization of prostitution to happen, we are going to have an exponentially larger number of survivors. So we could also need some funders to help us in that fight to get the equality model passed, which again is the partial decriminalization of prostitution.
Also, if I'm sorry that I interrupt, I just want to add this. I know, you and me usually when we were advocating out there, you used to mention how, survivors usually will be exploited by people that's close to them. Usually, people that has no experience human trafficking will think, oh, it's a stranger, or she got kidnapped, or it sometimes happen, but most of the times it could be your own uncle, it could be your own family member, it could be your own friend, it could be your own boyfriend, your own husband. So just putting that out there for any legislators or donors to have that in mind whenever this whole situation with the decriminalization, which flabbergasted me when I found out about it. How can anyone wish that on us? Just have that in mind, that you want to hold accountable these people. You want to make sure that we get justice. You want to make sure that we get the peace of mind that our children, our future generations won't experience the same thing that we did. So just want to put that out there.
Thank you for that.
I think it's important legislators just get educated. I don't think they fully understand human trafficking, right? And I don't think they understand the connection between the sex trade and human trafficking. So we do presentations all the time. Attend one of those and learn the basics and then support our advocacy efforts.
Absolutely. So we touched upon, what you would say, Jayne, to donors and legislators. Nicole, what would you say to the survivors that are listening to this right now who may not know where to go or get connected to resources? And additionally, what would you say to the direct service providers, the people who are founders of these organizations, the people who work there? What can they improve? What was good? What would you say to these two groups of people?
Okay. So for the survivors, what I've always been saying in different chances that I got is to never give up. When we are in the life, it feels that we don't have control over our own life or our own body. There was a point in my life where I really thought that there was nothing out there for me, but let me tell you, it's a complete lie. You're just lying yourself at some point to just try and survive in that world. So believe me, there is people out there that it's gonna open their arms to you and it's gonna do their best to help you out. So definitely look for those services. I know the shelter idea is very scary for many people. It was scary for me. It was scary for some friends. So definitely don't get held back for that. To the direct service providers, yes, thank you very much. That's the first thing that I want to say. Thank you very much. Your work, the work that you do as a service provider, as someone that plans, as someone that organizes all these programs or these workshops. Shout out to all the social workers. I have many social workers throughout my healing journey that I love and hold dear in my heart. Never give up on us either. don't leave us behind.
That's important.
Like keep fighting for us, because you're gonna find people like you and me that we are doing good, we're doing better, thanks to those that open their arms and say, I'm gonna give this piece of myself to this group of people, to this community. So thank you so much. Keep doing your best. Let us keep working hard, and let us keep doing better for our future generations.
I love that. It's always so wholesome towards the end. I think that's amazing. And it's a combination of things, right? Like I said in the very beginning of this episode, we like to big up New York City, and we got to do better New York City, right? And like Nicole was saying, like, we have some amazing social workers in the city. We have amazing social services in the city. We have organizations that do both direct service and advocacy on behalf of sex trafficking, prostitution, and sex trafficking survivors, in general, that are doing amazing work, that are serving us the way that we should be and treating us the way that we should be treated.
Saving people's lives.
That are working around the clock, 24 hours, to try to find a survivor a bed, or going onto the street and trying to provide like a place to sleep or shower, like trying to provide those hot meals. Therapists and mental health counselors who are working with us lifelong to try to undo these traumas. We have folks that are trying to get certified in understanding complex trauma in order to be able to help us with that. And on the flip side, we also have a lot of burnout. We have a lot of a lack of beds, right? Yep. We don't have enough funding. We have people who are in positions financially to be able to support this that don't want to support this. We have, legislators who are really iffy on how to approach this issue because they're too scared to take a stand, or they don't want to hurt people's feelings, etc., right? Or this false idea, this false narrative of being progressive when it comes to this issue because it has something to do with sex. And I think what I'm hearing in this entire episode, everything that we've talked about, is really just about focusing on immediate needs, getting our legislators to get on board and educate themselves on this issue, focus on long-term sustainability for survivors, making sure that scholarships and funding and school and vocational trainings and housing and medical services are all there for us. And all of these things comprehensively. The equality model, which is what we're focusing on, right? Focusing on those aftercare services that are comprehensive and wrap around so that we can continue to live our lives and be able to sit on podcasts like this and have these kind of conversations. So thank you both for all of those suggestions and call outs. And, I always like to end my episodes on a happier note, because the work that we do, just us surviving in and of itself, this is very difficult and very heavy for a lot of people to hear. And I know that we do this work every day, and I know that you're working on this field all the time. But most people aren't, right? So we always have to remember that people that are listening to this may be like, my goodness, that's a lot of, it's too much for a lot of people. It's very overwhelming at times. So I want to ask the both of you, as we bring this episode to a close, just to tell me one way that you use creativity as a form of resistance. Because oftentimes doing this work, being a survivor, working alongside survivors, we don't focus on things that bring us hope or joy. So what is something that you do? It could be a special skill or talent, or it could be something that just brings you joy. Can you mention that for everyone listening out there?
I watch way too much stupid YouTube reels. Sometimes you just need to. I watch those. I watch the cooking shows where kids are doing the cooking, because I don't cook at all.
Oh, I like that.
And that's like, the British baking show Junior, like, is what I have to do to turn my mind off of this work, because it's so hard.
We take it home with us most of the time, right? And as much as we tell ourselves, no, we're not going to take it home today, you can't help it. You're too attached. Which is why I always like to end on this note of something completely unrelated, because we forget that we're humans, right? We're not robots. We're not like anti-trafficking robots. So, okay, I'm going to add this British cooking
show. And I don't even cook and I don't even bake. But for some reason, the show relaxes me.
I love it.
And I don't think about...
I like regular cooking shows, so I'm definitely down to try a British one.
You are going to love the kids one.
I love it. You're going to love it. Okay, we'll add that to the show notes, folks. If you're listening, we're going to all be watching this new British baking show. Nicole, what about you? What brings you joy?
When I go back home, I come home not only physically tired, but emotionally tired as well. Yeah. Because I put my heart out there when I do my job. So what I like to do is pretty much just play video games. When I was
love
growing
that.
up, I didn't have a lot of access to like game consoles or video games at all. So now that, you know, I'm an adult, I have my adult money. Like, I'm gonna put that money into video games. I bought myself a new Nintendo, the latest one, and I was just like so excited, and I just been playing on it for like the past year and all these kind of games. Big fan of Legend of Zelda over here. Since I was little, I used to sneak into the library in my school and I used to read all the comics of Legend of Zelda. So now that I got the adult money, I just been dropping in on Legend of Zelda.
I love
so
it.
any Legend of Zelda fans out there, hi. Yeah.
I love that. Jayne, Nicole, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today and for all of your wonderful insight on the resources in New York City that we have for sex trafficking survivors. Thank you.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, y'all. Well, join me next week where I'll be inviting two amazing powerhouse guests that are going to talk about their long organizing careers, both on a grassroots level and on a global scale. I'm your host. See you next week.